opening up diagonals for both queen and bishop immediately. This pawn thrust dictates the early game's pawn structure and central influence. French defense establishes immediate pawn tension and prepares for a solid, often counterattacking, structure. Establishing central dominance, White immediately challenges Black's pawn and aims for piece activity. Challenging the center immediately, this response aims to disrupt White's pawn structure and open lines for piece activity. Developing the knight towards the center immediately contests Black's central pawn and prepares for kingside castling. Developing the knight here is standard, contesting the center and preparing to castle, though it slightly delays pawn liberation. Exposing the knight immediately adds pressure to Black's center and prepares for pawn advances. Developing the bishop to e7 solidifies the pawn chain and prepares for castling, a sensible defensive maneuver in this open French. Pushing the pawn creates immediate space and cramps the knight's natural squares, forcing a tactical redirection. Sacrificing queenside space, Black retreats the knight to a more flexible outpost, preparing to challenge White's central pawn. Clearing the bishop clears a path for the queen and opens the f-file for potential attack. Recapturing with the queen immediately activates her, eyeing the pawn on e5 and preparing for a central pawn storm. This pawn push aggressively claims central territory and prepares for a kingside pawn storm, though it weakens the e4 square. Expanding the queenside with pawn on a6 now seeks to gain vital space and potentially prepare a timely c5 breakthrough. Reasserting central influence, this knight readies for a queenside foray, preparing to outmaneuver Black's passive pawn structure. Confronting the central pawn chain, Black immediately seeks to undermine White's space advantage and open lines for counterplay. Liberating the d-file opens lines for attack and simplifies the pawn structure, but be mindful of Black's active queen. Developing the knight to a more active central square strengthens Black's control and prepares for pawn advances. Unlocking the queenside, White prepares to reinforce the d4 pawn and potentially launch an attack along the open files. Capturing the pawn opens lines and ignites tactical possibilities, but be mindful of the king's safety as the center destabilizes. Developing the bishop here improves its scope and prepares for castling, aiming to consolidate the pawn structure. Securing the monarch's safety with castling is paramount, and this move accomplishes that effectively. Repositioning the queen here aims to bolster the center and prepare for a potential kingside pawn storm. Unleashing the f-pawn creates a complex pawn structure and opens lines, a double-edged sword in this tactical landscape. This pawn capture opens a diagonal for the queen and prepares to contest the f-file, potentially creating attacking chances. Forcing a queen retreat after disrupting White's pawn chain opens crucial diagonals for your pieces. Recapturing on d3 with the queen maintains central piece activity and opens the d-file for future pressure, solidifying White's pawn structure. Reclaiming the pawn immediately is a natural reaction, but it opens up the f-file for your opponent's rook. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure prepares for future central expansion and prevents easy breaks for Black. Establishing a strong diagonal anchor for the bishop, preparing future knight maneuvers to the center. This daring thrust directly challenges the queenside pawn structure, creating immediate tactical complexities and potential weaknesses around Black's king. The queen bravely infiltrates, challenging White's center and preparing for a potential kingside assault. Opening the queen and bishop diagonals offers dynamic counterplay, simplifying into a potentially favorable exchange. Reclaiming the piece opens the f-file for your rook, a crucial step towards active counterplay. Castling queenside brings the king to safety and prepares for active pawn play on the flank. Establishing the rook on the d-file grants substantial control over that crucial central pathway, preparing for potential future advances or defensive maneuvers. Shifting the knight to a more active square prepares for future queenside expansion. Opening the c-file for the rook now allows it to penetrate the queenside. Launching a pawn storm against Black's kingside aims to dislodge defenders and create attacking lanes. Rerouting the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to contest the open files. Gaining kingside space, this pawn push aims to restrict black's knight and potentially open lines for attack. Creating a pawn barrier on the kingside now, this allows white's knight freedom and potentially weakens black's king. Reclaiming the d4 square allows the knight to become a more active central defender. Re-establishing pressure on the d-file, this rook's repositioning aims to exploit the unprotected white king. Aggressively pushing pawns opens lines, but leaves the king somewhat exposed if black can coordinate attackers. Shuffling the rook again offers little progress, allowing white to consolidate and prepare further attacking operations. Seeking a better outpost for the knight, aiming to pressure black's weakened queenside pawns. Black ignites the center, challenging white's initiative and aiming to unlock piece activity. Opening the f-file now creates dynamic pawn tension that black must carefully manage. Asserting central space creates a powerful pawn chain and threatens to disrupt white's king safety. Rerouting the knight to flank the d-pawn push offers defensive support and prepares for potential central pressure. Repositioning the rook to the 7th rank aims to activate it and potentially pressure white's queenside pawns. This move aims to activate the rook, creating pressure on the e-file and challenging black's central pawn majority. Preparing to challenge the open file, this maneuver aims to activate the rook and contest the central occupation. Shifting the knight to a more active square frees up the rook on the open c-file. Asserting control over the d-file, this maneuver prepares to challenge white's central structure and potentially open lines for black's pieces. Opening the c-file unleashes immediate pressure on black's rook, potentially forcing it to a less active square and disrupting its defensive structure. Reclaiming the knight's central influence, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and activate the minor piece. Securing the queenside, this establishes a robust pawn chain against black's encroaching knights. Unlocking the queenside, this pawn thrust immediately challenges white's queenside structure and opens new avenues for black's pieces. Suddenly opens the e-file, potentially creating pressure on black's king and disrupting their defensive setup with dynamic possibilities. Simplifying into a potentially favorable pawn-up endgame while opening up your rook. Snatching the pawn creates an immediate material advantage, but opens up the c-file for black's rook. Capturing the pawn opens a central diagonal, creating dynamic exchanges and influencing pawn structure balance. Opening the queenside to generate counterplay and contest the c-file. Securing the knight and challenging white's overloaded queenside pawn structure opens dynamic counterplay. Gaining control of the open c-file now solidifies pressure against black's queenside. Reclaiming the pawn with the bishop solidifies black's central pawn structure and prepares to contest the open files. Seizing the open file immediately puts pressure on black's isolated pawns and opens lines for white's rook. Reactivating the bishop to its attacking diagonal offers a glimmer of counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. Unyielding pressure on the d-file finally pays off, centralizing the rook to exploit black's exposed king. Repositioning the bishop to d5 offers improved support for the pawn push and prepares to contest the open files. Securing the knight on a stable outpost at e2 allows white to prepare for a kingside pawn push. Unleashing the pawn chain's energy, this advance aims to disrupt white's queenside control and activate black's dormant pieces. Asserting a kingside presence, this prepares a gradual advance to contain black's active queenside pawns. Unleashing a pawn to create a decisive passed threat on the queenside. Sacrificing the pawn allows the king to escape the immediate mating net and seek safety on the queenside. The bishop retreats to a square where it can eye the undefended white king and still support the passed pawn's advance. A determined recentering maneuver, aiming to bolster the beleaguered king's safety before the pawn storm engulfs the queenside. Repositioning the bishop to b5 aims to exploit white's vulnerable queenside pawns and activate the piece. The knights repositioning to B3 initiates a daring plan to contest the queenside pawns and potentially unleash the rook. The rook bravely ventures to the 7th rank, threatening the pawn and aiming to disrupt white's coordination. Bringing the knight back to center often signifies a shift towards consolidating positional gains and preparing for future maneuvers. The bishop repositions to a commanding diagonal, eyeing critical squares and preparing to disrupt white's pawn structure. Knight repositioning to exploit the vulnerable c-file and threaten the bishop on a4. The king bravely steps into the fray, seeking active participation despite the exposed position. Unpacking the rook to free, the knight offers potential for central dominance, aiming to exploit the open lines created by the pawn structure. Activating the rook along the 7th rank offers the best chance to disrupt white's advanced pawns and create counterplay. Harnessing the knight's outpost, white aims to stifle black's passed pawn and gain positional advantage. Securing the open file provides essential support for the rook's future activity against white's compromised queenside. Securing the king's advance allows white to prepare for an eventual pawn push with the pawn, aiming to gain space. Redirecting the bishop to a more passive square surrenders crucial light square control. Opening lines for your rook to become active on the queenside. Reactivating the bishop to h5 offers counterplay and eyes the queen's rook. Snatching the pawn severs black's connection to its pawn chain, potentially isolating it. Unleashing the rook to the 3rd rank creates a dangerous mating net that white's clumsy king cannot escape. Opening the b-file aggressively reclaims initiative and aims to dislodge the entrenched bishop. The king steps out of shadow, a bold gambit to ignite the game or risk immediate exposure. Unleashing the pawn's potential creates an inescapable fork on the king and rook. Unleashing the king into this messy affair, a daring gambit for activity amidst the chaos. Flipping the script, this rook maneuver seeks to tie down black's exposed king and create counterplay on the queenside.